All right, so you've given us this stack of legal excerpts to wade through.
And it's all about the UK's Environmental Protection Act of, get this, 1990.
Yeah, 1990. It sounds like ancient history in some ways.
It does. But looking through this thing, it's pretty incredible how forward-thinking it was.
Absolutely.
I mean, they were even addressing things like genetically modified organisms back then. Did they have a crystal ball or something?
Well, maybe not a crystal ball, but they definitely recognized some of the emerging environmental concerns that were, just starting to come into focus back then.
It makes you wonder what they would have thought about some of the stuff we're dealing with today.
But hey, that's why we're here, right?
Yeah.
To unpack this massive piece of legislation and pull out the most important bits for you.
Exactly. Think of it as like a guided tour through the highlights.
Exactly. We'll give you the inside scoop on what this act is all about, why it matters, and how it still impacts the UK's approach to environmental protection today.
Even if you're not a lawyer, you'll come away with a good grasp of the basics.
Exactly. No legal jargon required. So to set the scene a bit, this act primarily focuses on England, Scotland, and Wales.
Right. It's important to note that it doesn't directly apply to Northern Ireland.
Good point. And it basically boils down to two main things: controlling pollution and managing waste.
It's surprisingly comprehensive, covering everything from industrial emissions to noise pollution, even down to things like litter.
They really did think of everything, didn't they? It's like they wanted to create this all-encompassing blueprint for environmental accountability.
And that's a big part of what makes it so important. It's not just about setting out rules, it's about establishing a framework for action. It clearly defines who's responsible for what when it comes to protecting the environment.
It's like a who's who of environmental players. So let's talk about some of the key characters in this legal drama, shall we?
Sounds good.
First up, we've got the enforcing authorities, the ones with the power to make sure everyone's playing by the rules.
Hmm.
We're talking about big guns like the Environment Agency.
Right, they're kind of like the environmental police, in a way.
Exactly. And then there are local authorities who play a role too, depending on the specific issue.
And even some more specialized bodies, like port health authorities, who come into play in certain situations.
Right, because what happens at the ports can definitely have environmental impacts. So you've got this whole network of organizations tasked with keeping things in check.
It's a team effort, for sure.
And on the flip side, you've got the regulated entities. And let me tell you, this act casts a pretty wide net. We're talking everyone from everyday citizens to massive industrial facilities.
Basically, anyone whose actions could potentially impact the environment is on their radar.
It's a good reminder that we all have a role to play in this, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's not just about telling people to be good. This act lays down the law, outlining specific duties for these regulated entities, and, crucially, setting out the consequences if they don't comply.
And that's where things get really interesting, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. Because this act doesn't mess around when it comes to enforcement. They've got some serious tools in their arsenal.
One of the most powerful being the enforcement notice.
Oh, yeah. This isn't just a friendly reminder to tidy up your act. This is a legal order.
Exactly. And it'll often outline specific actions that need to be taken to remedy a situation where someone's gone astray.
And ignoring one of these is a big no-no. You might as well wave goodbye to a chunk of your profits. Or worse.
Well, that's the thing. The Act outlines a whole range of penalties for non-compliance, depending on the severity of the violation.
We're talking hefty fines, charges against properties, even the possibility of having equipment or vehicles seized.
They really do mean business.
Oh, absolutely. They wanted to make it crystal clear that environmental violations have serious consequences. But it's not all doom and gloom, right?
No, definitely not.
There are safeguards built into the system, too.
Right, it's not a one-way street. The Act does include provisions for appeals, recognizing that there might be situations where things aren't so clear-cut.
Exactly. And that's where things can get really interesting, at least from a legal perspective.
Absolutely. Because there's often nuance in how these legal frameworks are applied in real-world situations.
Right. It's not always black and white. And in those gray areas, well, let's just say a clever legal mind might find some wiggle room.
It's a good reminder that law isn't static. It's a constantly evolving field.
Okay, so we've set the scene, we've met the key players, we've explored the high-stakes world of enforcement. Now, let's get our hands dirty, shall we?
Let's dive into one of the Act's central concerns, waste management.
The glamorous world of rubbish.
Hey, one person's trash is another person's treasure, or so they say. But seriously, this Act goes deep on waste. It's not just about what goes in your bin. It's about classifying different types of waste, figuring out how to handle it safely, and ultimately how to minimize our impact on the environment.
And it's here that you really start to see the Act's forward-thinking nature because it doesn't treat all waste the same.
Ah, so you're telling me my empty cereal box isn't in the same league as, say, nuclear waste?
Well, maybe not quite. But you've hit on a key point. The Act introduces these different categories of waste. Controlled waste is the big one, and that covers most of what we think of as household and industrial waste. But then you've got things like hazardous waste, which obviously needs to be handled with much more care due to the risks involved.
Right, so different rules for different types of rubbish. Makes sense to me.
Exactly, and it's all about making sure waste is managed in a way that protects both human health and the environment.
Okay, so we've got mountains of waste, we've got categories, we've got regulations. What's the plan then? How does the Act say we should actually deal with all this stuff?
Well, it all boils down to this really elegant concept called the waste management hierarchy, and it basically acts as a roadmap for dealing with waste responsibly.
Hit me with it.
All right, so at the top of the hierarchy, you have waste reduction and reuse. That's the gold standard.
So basically trying to avoid creating waste in the first place.
Exactly, because the best way to deal with waste is to not create it at all.
Makes sense. What's next?
Next comes recycling, which most people are familiar with.
Blue bins, green bins. We've got it down to a science.
And then, only as a last resort, do you have disposal.
Right, because ultimately, some things just can't be avoided.
Exactly. But the important point here is that the Act isn't just about finding new and better ways to get rid of stuff. It's about encouraging a fundamental shift in how we think about waste.
From a throwaway society to a more circular economy, where resources are used more sustainably.
Exactly. And to make this happen, the Act includes a whole bunch of provisions specifically designed to support responsible waste handling and boost recycling rates.
Like those color-coded bins we see everywhere in the UK.
Exactly. That's a direct result of this Act's emphasis on making recycling easy and accessible for everyone. But it's not just about what happens in our homes, of course.
Right. We can't forget about the big players in this game. The ones dealing with industrial-scale waste, hazardous materials, the whole 9 yards.
And that's where the Act's licensing requirements come in.
Ah, so you can't just decide to open up a waste processing plant in your backyard.
Not quite. It's a bit like needing a driving license to operate a vehicle. You need to demonstrate that you have the knowledge, the skills, and the facilities to handle waste safely and responsibly.
It's all about protecting people and the environment from potential harm.
Exactly. Because waste management, if it's not done properly, can have serious consequences. But the thing is, it's not just these big companies that need to pay attention.
Right, we all have a part to play.
The Act outlines specific duties for individuals, too, like making sure you're separating your waste at home and not just chucking everything in the same bin.
And let's not forget about those hefty fines for littering. No one wants to be caught short for dropping a crisp packet on the pavement.
A very tangible reminder that environmental protection starts with individual actions.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how this one piece of legislation has had such a profound impact on something as seemingly mundane as how we deal with our rubbish.
It really highlights how interconnected these issues are.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on waste management. But as comprehensive as it is, it's important to remember that this act doesn't stop there.
It's true, there's so much more to unpack.
This act is like a legal onion, layers upon layers of rules and regulations covering a vast array of environmental concerns.
A very appropriate analogy.
So let's peel back another layer, shall we? Remember those noisy neighbors we mentioned earlier?
Yes. A classic example of how environmental concerns can sometimes hit a little too close to home, quite literally.
Exactly. Well, the act addresses that too through this interesting concept of statutory nuisances.
It's a surprisingly broad category, encompassing everything from noise and smoke to dust, smells, and even light pollution.
It's like they tried to think of every possible thing that could make your neighbor's property a source of, shall we say, environmental distress.
And it's not just about identifying these nuisances. The Act empowers local authorities to take action.
Right. They can step in and say, all right, enough is enough, get that barking dog under control, or else.
Exactly. They can issue abatement notices requiring whoever's responsible to address the problem, and if those aren't followed, well, remember those penalties we talked about earlier.
Yikes. So if you've got a neighbor who's making your life a misery with their leaf blower or their all-night karaoke sessions, this act might just be your new best friend.
Indeed. It's a great example of how this legislation tries to address not just those big, abstract environmental problems, but also the tangible, everyday issues that can impact people's quality of life.
And speaking of addressing things that were ahead of their time, let's circle back to those genetically modified organisms.
Yes, GMOs, a topic that still sparks debate and controversy even today.
It's amazing to think that they were already thinking about this stuff back in 1990 when the technology was still in its early stages.
It really shows how forward-thinking they were, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder how they were able to anticipate these emerging challenges and build a framework flexible enough to accommodate them.
And that's a question that takes us right to the heart of what makes this act so fascinating. Because it's not just a historical document, it's a living, breathing framework that continues to shape environmental policy in the UK today.
So as we continue our deep dive, we're going to explore how this act has evolved over time to keep pace with new challenges, new technologies, and a growing awareness of the interconnectedness of environmental issues.
And we'll see how the legacy of this 1990 Act continues to influence the UK's approach to environmental protection in the 21st century. So we've spent some time unpacking the Environmental Protection Act of 1990.
A real blast from the past.
It is, but as we've seen, it's far from a dusty old relic. This act continues to shape environmental policy in the UK even today.
It's like the gift that keeps on giving.
In a way, yes. And that's because the act's creators were incredibly forward-thinking. They understood that environmental protection isn't a one-and-done deal. It's a constantly evolving challenge that requires a flexible and adaptable approach.
It's like they built a framework with room to grow, kind of like a tree planting its roots.
Exactly. They couldn't have predicted every single environmental issue we'd be facing in the 21st century.
Right, like who could have imagined microplastics ending up in everything?
Exactly. Or the sheer volume of e-waste we're generating these days. These were not top-of-mind concerns back in 1990, but the Act was designed in a way that allows it to adapt and address these new challenges as they emerge.
So it's like they created this sort of environmental constitution, laying down the fundamental principles and leaving it open to interpretation and adaptation as needed.
That's a great way to put it. It's about establishing a clear direction, a set of overarching goals, rather than getting bogged down in overly prescriptive rules and regulations that could quickly become outdated.
Makes sense. So how does that actually work in practice? I mean, the Act itself is a product of its time, right? It reflects the environmental concerns and the scientific understanding of the late 20th century,
Absolutely.
but the world doesn't stand still. So how has this act managed to keep up with the times?
Well, one of the key mechanisms for adaptation is the amendment process.
Right, because laws can be changed, updated, and tweaked as needed.
Exactly. And the Environmental Protection Act has seen its fair share of amendments and revisions since its inception in 1990.
It's like adding new chapters to a book as the story unfolds.
I like that analogy. Some of these amendments have been relatively minor, addressing specific technicalities or clarifying existing provisions.
Keeping things up to date.
Precisely. But there have also been more substantial changes, reflecting significant shifts in policy or the emergence of entirely new environmental challenges.
So it's not just about fixing typos and adding footnotes. Sometimes you need to rewrite entire sections to keep pace with a rapidly changing world.
Absolutely. And one of the most striking examples of this is how the Act has been adapted to address climate change.
Which, let's be honest, was barely a blip on the radar back in 1990.
Exactly. It wasn't a primary focus of the Act as it was originally written, but as awareness of climate change grew and the scientific evidence became impossible to ignore.
The Act had to evolve.
Exactly, and it did. Over the years, there have been several amendments specifically aimed at incorporating climate change considerations into the UK's environmental policy framework.
So what kind of changes are we talking about here? Give me some examples.
Well, for instance, amendments have been made to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from various industries.
Right, because that's a major contributor to climate change.
Exactly. The Act now includes provisions for setting and enforcing emissions limits, promoting energy efficiency, and encouraging the development of cleaner technologies.
It's like taking those old polluting factories and giving them a 21st century makeover.
In a way, yes. But it goes beyond just individual industries. Amendments have also been made to promote carbon reduction targets at a national level.
So it's about creating a more sustainable future across the board.
Exactly. And these amendments haven't happened in a vacuum. They've been driven by scientific research, technological advancements, evolving societal values, and of course, political will.
It's a reminder that environmental protection is never a done deal. It's an ongoing process that requires constant vigilance adaptation, and a willingness to reevaluate our priorities as new challenges emerge.
And that's what makes the Environmental Protection Act of 1990 such a fascinating case study. It shows us that it is possible to create a legal framework that is both robust and flexible, capable of adapting to changing circumstances without losing sight of its core principles.
It's a testament to the power of forward-thinking legislation and the importance of creating a system that can evolve alongside our understanding of the world around us. It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
What's that?
This acted like a time traveler from a bygone era.
I see what you mean.
We're talking shoulder pads, cassette tapes, the height of the new kids on the block.
Ah, the good old days.
And yet here we are, decades later, still talking about this piece of legislation like it's brand new.
It speaks volumes about its enduring relevance, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's like those classic fashion trends that always seem to find their way back into style.
There's something timeless about it.
Exactly. And I think part of what makes the Environmental Protection Act of 1990 so resilient is that it's grounded in these really solid fundamental principles.
Principles that have stood the test of time.
Exactly. We're talking about accountability, responsibility, a recognition that we're all in this together when it comes to protecting the environment.
It's not just about pointing fingers at polluters or wagging a finger at people who litter.
It's about fostering a sense of shared responsibility.
Exactly. Recognizing that we all have a role to play, from individuals to industries to the government.
And that's a message that resonates just as strongly today as it did back in 1990.
Perhaps even more so, given the scale of the environmental challenges we're facing now.
Okay, so we've established that this act is pretty darn impressive.
It's a real feather in the cap for UK environmental law.
But it's more than just a historical curiosity, right?
Absolutely not.
This act has had a real, tangible impact on the ground, shaping the way the UK tackles environmental issues.
From those early days of cracking down on industrial pollution and cleaning up hazardous waste sites,
To promoting recycling, regulating GMOs, and giving people the tools to address those everyday environmental nuisances that can drive you bonkers.
it's been a driving force behind a whole range of positive changes.
It's like the act provided the seeds, and over time, those seeds have grown into a whole forest of environmental initiatives and policies.
A very poetic way to put it.
But it's true. And as we wrap up our deep dive into this fascinating piece of legislation, I think it's important to reflect on what we can learn from it.
Because there are valuable lessons here that go beyond the specifics of UK environmental law.
Exactly. For me, one of the key takeaways is the importance of thinking long-term, of creating a framework that's not just about addressing the immediate crisis.
But that's adaptable enough to evolve and respond to the challenges of tomorrow.
Right, because the only constant is change, especially when it comes to something as complex and dynamic as the environment.
We need to be prepared to adapt, to innovate, and to constantly reevaluate our approach as new information comes to light.
It's like that saying, the only way to make sense out of change is to plunge into it, move with it, and join the dance.
And the Environmental Protection Act of 1990, in its own way, embodies that idea.
It's a testament to the power of forward-thinking legislation and the importance of creating a system that can adapt to the ever-changing rhythms of the natural world.
It's been a pleasure joining you on this deep dive.
Likewise. And for those of you listening, we hope you've enjoyed this journey through the fascinating world of environmental law.
Remember, knowledge is power.
So keep asking questions, keep exploring, and keep those legal documents coming.
We'll be here to help you make sense of it all.
Until next time.